Street?
I hadn't made
Yes.
so.
Okay.
Yep.
He asked me if
Okay, we
he
are
wanted to
live.
give me an address, and so I sent him a box full of stars. It's like there was a kid who had cancer who wanted.
We're live,
Sorry.
so go ahead.
Go ahead and start.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and this is the second in a series on the state of Christianity in North America and how possibly it could be revitalized. Last week, we looked at the bad news, which is that all religions...
I gotta stop you again and have you
Okay.
start again. All right, now it says, go ahead.
Okay.
Start again, I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Welcome, I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and this is the second in a series on the state of Christianity in North America and possible ways in which it could be revitalized. Last week, we looked at the bad news, which is that all religions in North America are declining. That for the first time in the history of the United States, I'm getting feedback, or
Are you hearing something?
yeah, I'm hearing you.
It's probably the recording.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So just go right ahead, just
Okay.
power on.
Sorry. In 1972, only 8% of the American population reported that they were not religious, meaning they did not belong to any religious institution and had no intention of doing so. Now, according to Gallup polls and many other polls, it's over 30%. So that is a dramatic drop-off. And as last week we talked about, it's not the problem of any particular religious group, as had been thought. Maybe it's just the Protestant main line, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, United Church of Christ. But it's every form of Protestantism, including evangelicals, including the megachurch movement. It's Roman Catholics and Jews and Muslims and members of Eastern religions. It's everybody. Even the number of people who report being spiritual but not religious is down. So what we're talking about is the dramatic growth in the last couple of decades of a group of people who are not members of any religious body, don't show much interest in spirituality, and don't say usually that they are either agnostic or atheists. So it's not that they are convinced, very thoughtful, intentional non-believers. It's just that religion of any sort is just not on their radar screen. They haven't decided to be atheists, they just don't think about it. And that's new. So what I'd like to do today is a couple of things. One is look at who these people are and what are their characteristics, and then shift gears a little bit to think about why in the past have people wanted to be religious. And then next week we're going to look at understandings of the church in the Reformed tradition. And then finally we're going to look at what, if anything, can or should be done about this. So right now, what are the characteristics of the folk who are becoming neither spiritual nor religious? In the literature about this, they're called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. And the results, one of the results to me was not surprising, but one very much was surprising. The not surprising result is that they tend to be predominantly young, as in younger than baby boomers. That's not surprising. And another thing that's not surprising is amongst these young people, a big chunk of them, but not the majority, but a big chunk of them, tend to be college educated, upwardly mobile, and have grown up in a multicultural urban or suburban context. You might say they're the hipsters, what used to be called yuppies. And typically, that from grammar school on, they have lived in an environment with multiple ethnicities, multiple religions, and multiple perspectives on life. And they've liked it. They've gotten used to it. They think that's normal. So they end up being very comfortable with ambiguity and with multiple perspectives. Think of young relatives you might have who had roommates in college who, while they were getting ready to celebrate a Christian or a Jewish holiday, were celebrating Ramadan or celebrating absolutely nothing. And what's striking is the bonds these people have with one another. So they find it very difficult to believe that the religious tradition in which they may have been raised is right and the others are wrong. For example, that they can't, if it's an evangelical Christian who goes to college and they have an Islamic roommate, they find it difficult to believe that the Islamic roommate is going to hell because they don't believe in Jesus Christ. And as a result, they end up being somewhat suspicious of any truth claims whatsoever. If somebody says, I know what the truth is, I'm right, you're wrong, my tradition is right, your tradition is wrong, they are very highly suspicious. So truth with a capital T is something to which most of them have an allergic reaction. Following from this, they tend to like questions rather than answers. They enjoy the prospect of exploring human problems, in other words, they don't want to be told what the meaning of life is. They want to quest for it. And they often become unhappy or dissatisfied when it looks like they're approaching an answer, because it's the journey rather than the destination that is exciting for them. In terms of Myers-Briggs personality typology, they tend to be Ps who don't like closure, who like to leave questions open-ended. And along with that, they don't like authority and they don't like structures. So they don't like anyone who tells them what to believe. They'd rather have a sort of, in regard to pedagogy, they prefer a Socratic method, a teacher who just stimulates questions but does not provide answers. And along with that, they don't like structure. They like to leave things loose, spontaneous. If you feel like chasing a rabbit track, go ahead and do it. I've noticed amongst my own younger students, when it looks to me like they're drifting out of the conversation or not paying attention to a lecture, but they're on their mobile device, what I realized after talking to them, and sometimes I express discontent with that, it's like, that's rude. And they'll say, but you said something that I wanted to explore. So I Googled it online, and then I saw something online that caught my attention, so I Googled that too. So they tend to think in branches and networks rather than in a logical sequence. To older generations like me, it looks like they all have ADD. They just can't focus and they can't keep their attention. But from their perspective, they're just in love with exploration and unstructured, free exploration, which you learn from the internet. It networks, it branches out. So structures that fence them in and cause them to try to be linear are anathema to this generation. I'll point out, so far, this kind of looks bad for many churches. You have people who don't like authority, don't like structure, don't like answers. What they do like are communities that are small, intimate, and interpersonal. They don't like bureaucracies, don't like flowcharts, don't like hierarchies, prefer chat rooms that you can float in or out of, that don't have a standard membership, that don't have dues, where you can show up one week and maybe not show up the next week, or informal gatherings at Starbucks or at a bar or in people's living rooms. So, high comfort level with being a multi-perspectival, multicultural, suspicion of truth claims, delight in questions rather than answers, dislike of structures, dislike of closure, and suspicious of authority, but favoring non-bureaucratic, more interpersonal and informal varieties of community. So these are young folk, or at least younger than me, living in cities or suburbs, usually with industrial campuses around them, college educated, often with professional degrees, going into a profession, and often, and this is surprisingly important, often a profession that requires them to interact with people who didn't grow up like them, particularly in business world and technology and education, folk in other countries with whom they develop online friendships. So that's the group that I would have predicted would not be particularly interested in religious institutions. The other group surprised me, really surprised me, and it seems to me to be counterintuitive, but it's actually the larger group. It might be 40% the group I just talked about, but 60% this other group. This other group is also young, as in their post-baby boom, but far from being college educated, they're the opposite. They're folk who are undereducated, who did not go to college, who might not have finished high school. And as a result, are not professional and are somewhat economically hopeless. I mean, they don't expect their economic situation to improve. They feel stuck and stagnant. They tend to be rural or in economically distressed parts of cities. They are, as I suggested, they're undereducated. They see little opportunity for advancement economically, socially, culturally, in any way, shape, or form. And they are younger people who might well have tattooed on them somewhere, born to lose. They have a sense of doom. And as a result of that, they also dislike authority, but not for the same reason as the other group. This group dislikes authority because they feel that authority is oppressing them and is responsible for their stagnation. So they dislike elites intensely, any kind of elite. And they see elites all over the place, holding them down. They don't join anything. And this was also a little bit surprising. It's not only that they don't join churches, they don't join clubs, teams, anything. They don't join political parties. They largely don't vote. So these are not the young people who showed up, let's say, in the insurrection on January 6th, because those people were politically engaged and joined things. These are folk who just fly under the radar. They don't vote, they don't join political parties, they don't join teams, they don't join sports leagues, and they certainly do not join churches. To put it another way, they seem to have intensely low self-esteem. And so when they're interviewed, one of the reasons why they say they don't go to church is they say, well, people would look down on me there. Or I don't have the right kind of clothes. Or I just don't know how to act in church. I'm not good enough. And these are the bulk of the nuns. This is 60% of the nuns fall in this category. And what's kind of scary about it, they're content with it. They say, well, my life's going nowhere, but that's okay. I'll just try to have as much fun as I can in the meantime. This is a population I usually, because my life is sort of insulated, I usually don't bump into them, don't have in-depth conversations with them, and I really didn't know that there are multitudes of them out there, and they see no point in going to church. They seem to be content with, well, life's miserable, I'm stuck in it, but that's okay. Okay, before we shift to an entirely different discussion, anybody want to respond to these descriptions of the two groups that are basically constituting the nuns? Yeah.
On that second group, if they feel economically hopeless, they are not attracted then to the so-called prosperity gospel?
Probably some are, but most not.
Repeat the question.
The question was, would these young people who feel kind of hopeless, would they be attracted to the prosperity gospel, the notion that God will help you improve? It turns out not, that they don't believe it. It seems counterintuitive to them when everything they've tried or everything they've seen their parents try to improve their situations has failed. So in a way, they're nihilistic. If they like anything that's sort of a worldview, it tends to be something dark. Like they seem to have, or at least some of them, particularly the males, an interest in things like Norse. If they like any religion, it might be Norse religion, where there's the theme of Ragnarok, where the heroes living in Valhalla will join the gods and fight the frost demons and lose. So that's what you get to look forward to. You die with a sword in hand, you go to heaven, you party for a while in a mead hall in Valhalla, and then there's the final battle with the frost giants, and the frost giants lose, and the frost giants win, and it's eternal winter forever, and humanity is exterminated. Have a nice day. That's sort of the worldview, and it goes along with interests in vampires.
So this second group that you're talking about, I'm thinking about something you mentioned last week when you were talking about why people aren't going to church anymore. And one of the things that you brought up was the fact that life is better, and that we've enjoyed more luxuries and more leisure and all this sort of stuff, we just stopped wanting to go to church. So that's obviously not why this people group isn't want to go. It's also probably not based on science and understanding of our education of the world and how it functions and stuff like that scientifically, because you're saying they're not educated. Some of them are not even finishing high school.
Right.
So why is this group not going then?
Right, that's a good question. The observation was, last week we talked about many people not being as religious as past generations because life on earth is better. There's more prosperity, more opportunity, more opportunities for enjoyment. And if you have a problem, the hope is that technology and science will be able to resolve it for you, or at least you can get online and forget about it. And this seems to be the exact opposite, where the perception is life is bad. And I think that's a very good question, because in the past, when life felt bad to people, they got religious. But now, these folk, which is puzzling, and I don't know the answer to that one, when life seems bad, they become nihilistic rather than religious. And that's a new thing.
I have a question. Last week you talked about, I think you said the Swedes, you went to Sweden, and you said that you said in your mind, they were really consumed with understanding what the meaning of life was, and so you were sitting down with someone, and you said like, it must be like gloomy for you to be so consumed with that, and the person was like, no, like, I know we're gonna die, and I'm gonna just enjoy myself while I'm here.
Yeah.
And so, I wonder, is there a socioeconomic difference between those people and then the second group you're talking about? Because you just said, like, they've accepted that, like, life is tough, and, like, there probably aren't a lot of things they can do to fix it. So is that similar to, Swedish people who say, we don't really need to consume ourselves, we're trying to figure out, the meaning of life, because regardless, we're gonna die. So I just want to know if there's like a correlation.
Yeah, thank you. And the other remark was, last week I did talk about some young folk college kids that I lived with in Denmark, who's didn't seem to ask questions about the meaning of life, but were just content to enjoy life, party, and that they realized then you die, but they thought, well, that's not so bad, that just means the party's over. At least we had a good party. So they were not religious, and that's typical of Northern Europe. Yeah, I would put those folk in the first category, sort of the upwardly mobile, well-educated hipster nuns, and they're there. Yeah, and this group is almost the exact opposite. One thing I didn't mention about this last group, the sort of the hopeless ones, is they also tend to be homogenous. They often are found in small cities, or small towns rather, in rural areas or in enclaves in cities where everybody they know is like them. They are not multicultural. They're the exact opposite. Some economists point out that these are the people who have been left behind by the global economy. They may have been machinists, let's say, or their parents may have been machinists, and now the drill press has been automated, and that function is being performed by a robot. So they're often found in the Rust Belt. Yeah.
Yeah, well, my question was, are these, in a family situation, are these the second generation where the parents did not go to college, they didn't go to college, they saw no reason for it, no hope for it?
Yeah.
So they're just emulating their parents but on a lower scale, whereas some of us emulated our parents but tried to step up.
Yeah. The answer was, what about their parents? Were their parents college educated? Did their parents graduate from high school? And what seems to be the trajectory here for these people is their downward mobility is their family history. So their grandparents may have had like a well-paying job in a factory, but then the factory closed, and their parents were hurt by that. And now they have no hope of finding anything except minimum wage. But that's projected onto life as a whole, that life is a downward slide. Yeah.
And the first group that you described as sort of searching for community, last week we mentioned the idea of bowling alone. So is the search for community one that is not necessarily a physical community in one place, but a more diffuse, digital, virtual community?
Yeah, well, for this last group, the community is sort of ad hoc, informal. You just hang around with some of your friends who feel the same way in a bar. And that's it. This last group, they don't join anything at all. And as I said, the frequency with which they do not vote is astonishing.
I have a question. So we're talking about like the downward trend of like their access to things. And so I wonder, you say that they're nihilistic, and I can see that, but do you think that so if I'm a minimum wage worker, right, and I know like based on my circumstances I can't get a better job, would that influence my decision to not go to church on Sunday because I just worked 16 hours the day before? Would the fact that I'm not wealthy enough to get a car influence me not joining a group?
Yeah, the question, the observation there was, could economic circumstances, namely, you're economically distressed discourage folk from going to church, maybe because you feel like you don't have decent clothes, or you don't have a car, or you can't afford the gas, or you're working 16 hours a day and you're exhausted. And that's probably the case. But the exhaustion part and the economic distress seems to get generalized to an attitude towards life in general. That reality is harsh and cruel, and it's stepping on you. And so to folk who feel that very deeply in their very bones, to say, but there is a loving God who cares for you, they just find that to be ridiculous. You're stringing me along. Okay, now we're going to shift gears towards something else as to why in the past have people been religious and joined religious institutions. And there I'll invite you to reflect on yourselves. Why are you here? Because as this seems to indicate, this rise of the nuns, that it used to be the case that it was assumed that people would be religious. And why somebody wouldn't be religious was the big question. Now it's flipped. Now in our culture, it seems to be the case that folk assume that not being religious is the norm, and if you are religious, that's what requires explanation. With my, I may have mentioned this last time, but with my 30-something nephew's friends, when I say, well, I'm a Christian theologian, they're intrigued by that because they think it's so weird. I could have said, I'm an alchemist, and I'm looking for the philosopher's stone, and I would get the same shocked response that they're interested because they think it's exotic. So for them, not being religious is the norm, and what requires explanation is why would anybody ever want to? So looking at reasons people have given in the past in autobiographies, spiritual journals, sermons, books of theology, you can see certain common denominators. There's no single answer, but there are several different ones, and let's see which ones might apply to you. And then we're going to ask, why aren't these answers applying to the nuns? Okay, one is simple. Life's hard, there's illness, there's sickness, there's death, there's tragedy, there's war, there's depression, there's anxiety, and therefore many people naturally have hope that there might be something better. There might be another dimension. We might have a home far away, over the rainbow, heaven, eternity. Maybe it's beyond space and time. Maybe it's a future state. Maybe it's post-mortem. But there's got to be something better than this. The sweet by and by. And for some people, that's the reason for joining churches, for praying, for engaging in private devotion, to get in touch with that other dimension, and to have some expectation that somehow we will be able to enter it, either through moments of ecstasy in this life, through contemplation, let's say, or at least after you die, going to heaven. So that's one. Another reason that's often given is that our moral codes, our ethics, our values, need some sort of grounding. That we need to feel that the universe does have built into it a difference between right and wrong. That we humans are not just inventing it, and that it's not just relative to particular societies or cultures. That, for example, using chemical warfare is just wrong. And it's not just that we don't like it or we think it's wrong, it's that it's really objectively wrong. And there's something in the universe that prohibits that. You might say that in most religions, that there is a God who has established some things as being virtuous and some things as being evil. Or if not a God, maybe there's just a nature of things, or a Tao, or karma, but there's something that grounds our sense of right and wrong. And that's religion. So we are religious in order to undergird and support our morality. So you should love your neighbor, not just because somebody told you to love your neighbor, or you feel like loving your neighbor, but because God said so. So that's, or think of the old slogan, the family that prays together stays together. There's the notion that if you want your family to really feel the obligation to stay together, then you should get in touch with God. That God undergirds family morality and family cohesion. And that's been a theme ever since the Enlightenment in the 18th century amongst many people. That our moral codes, let's say, the Boy Scout code, being trustworthy and honest and helpful, that the Boy Scouts didn't make that up. That comes from the universe. That comes from God. So ever since the 18th century, there have been large chunks of religious people who say, I'm religious because I want to have my morality reinforced, or I want my children to be moral, and therefore I send them to church. You probably know folk, or maybe you have yourself said, I'm going to send my children to church, to Sunday school, so they will get good morals. And if you throw in, because they're not getting them from school, or they're not getting them from their peers, that ups the ante. So now we got two big reasons. Go to church in order to have hope beyond tragedy, pain, suffering, and death. That was the first one. And this one is go to church to ground morality and some particular moral code. Now the third one is akin to the moral code thing, and that's that most cultures throughout history have felt the need to ground their entire way of life, their culture, their society, their politics, their economics, in a sense of this is the way the universe is. We're not inventing this. So that most cultures, let's take nations, that's where it's clearest. Most nations have wanted some sort of sense that God was on their side. Think of the German troops in World War I who had Gott mit uns, God with us, on their belt buckles. Or think of the conflict in Russia and the Ukraine right now, which is partly, probably very partly, but somewhat, a tension between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, where the Russian Orthodox Church says that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's way of life is just wrong. Or think of the American Civil War, when both sides thought that they were fighting a crusade to defend a divinely sanctioned way of life. The abolitionists in the North saying that God hates slavery. In Jesus Christ we are free. And if we're spiritually free, we should be politically and economically free. Then the Confederates saying, but the Old Testament says that you should own slaves. God commanded the Israelites to enslave the Canaanites. So that's what we're doing. We're just being good Christians here. So both sides thought that they were doing God's will, and that God was on their side. Before the Battle of Gettysburg, you probably know this, live in Pennsylvania, both the Northern and the Southern armies experienced major religious revivals. And both went into the battle thinking that God was with them and their side. Most cultures have done that. Think of the American way of life. If you're old enough, remember the TV show Superman? It started out with Superman, and I forgot what it was, but he had a big American flag behind him, and he was it was clear he was fighting for the American way of life, which was, anybody remember what the words were?
Truth, justice, and something.
American way.
Yeah, truth, justice, and the American way. And then the flag fluttering behind Superman would come on. Or think of, the British are particularly good at this, where they, in many British cathedrals with stained glass windows that were built after World War I, usually in the windows, they will have, you know, the standards, Moses, Jesus, Paul, and then they'll have some fallen heroes from World War I, British, up there as the saints, you know, or just the phrase for God, King, and country, which after the war, one British aristocrat said, in my day, it was King first and God second. That's this view on steroids, where the purpose of religion is to, as some sociologists say, spread a sacred canopy over a nation or a community, to give people a sense that their way of life is holy, that their way of structuring society is good and virtuous and is God's will. So that goes back to the god kings of Egypt and the ancient Near East. It goes back to the pharaohs. It goes back to the Roman emperors, who were also the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman religion. It goes, and it's in having "In God We Trust" on our dollar bills, in the "One Nation Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. It's been pretty universal. Another one that's been very popular, it keeps coming back, is maybe people are just instinctively religious. Maybe we go to church because we have spiritual hungers that nothing else can satisfy. Maybe down deep we all have a feeling that we are not the center of the universe, and we want to worship and trust and be loyal to something that is the center of the universe. So we go to church to do that. I think in the past, and Presbyterians are actually very, very good at that. I mean, John Calvin said, down we know it's not all about us. I mean, he said, I know it's not all about me. He was a very God-centered guy. It's about God, it's not about me, and I go to church in order to do something about that. In fact, I've invented a new form of Christianity in order to do something about that. And at the core of the Presbyterian heritage, we'll talk about this next week, is the sense that I'm not the center of things, and I should be humble and put myself last and be more concerned about what God is doing in the rest of society and in the rest of the cosmos. As I mentioned this before, but I think it's very illustrative. It used to be a Presbyterian ordination question. Are you willing to go to hell for the glory of God? And the expectation was a candidate for ministry would say yes. And that was supposed to be indicative of the fact that I'm not spiritually selfish. If I would help God and humanity by going to hell, then so be it. Because it's not about me, it's about God. God wants me in hell, I'm going. So when this question sort of died out in the 1920s and 30s, but in one, I had a student who was being examined on the floor of Presbytery, and she was perfectly orthodox, and it was boring. And so an older minister there said, let me ask you a question that I was asked when I was ordained. Are you willing to go to hell for the glory of God? She'd never heard that before, but she was quick on her feet. And she said, I can do better than that. This whole presbytery can go to hell for the glory of God. And then another student, I wasn't there for this one, said, yeah, I'm willing to go to hell for the glory of God, but not West Virginia. But that's just an indication of the seriousness with which this maybe intuition that I'm not the center and I need to get in touch with and worship and adore that which is the center runs deep for some human beings. Or maybe the intuition might be different. It might not be I intuit that I'm not the center, but I want to find out what is the center. It might just be that you feel dependent upon a force greater than your own. And it's not just oxygen and food and water, that there's something underneath all of that that's sustaining you in existence, that put you here when you didn't ask to be or do anything to be put on earth, but you find yourself here, you find yourself still alive, being sustained, and you feel in your gut, it's not a rational thing, it's a visceral thing, that there's something out there supporting you and holding you up, and you trust it, and you're grateful to it, and you go to church to express your gratitude, your thankfulness, and to reinforce that sense that, yes, I am sustained, and I am thankful and grateful for that fact. German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher called that the feeling of absolute dependence. That we're absolutely dependent upon a force that's out there. He called it the whence, with a capital W. The whence from which we come and to which we shall return. I was teaching a course once with undergraduates, and I asked them to write a paper on this. And one guy turned in a paper, and he said, Schleiermacher worshipped the Earth Mother. And I said, where'd you get that from? He said, well, you said it in a lecture. I said, what? He said, well, you said that Schleiermacher believed in the cosmic wench. So, but this isn't the wench, this is the whence. There's something out there that we call God, from which we come and that is sustaining us, and to which we shall return. Or the intuitive feeling that makes people religious might be just a sense of oneness of all things, where you walk on the Appalachian Trail and you just feel like, I'm part of the ecosystem. You know, I have something in common with the trees and the lichen and the little birds and the dirt. We're all one. And that is a comforting and liberating feeling. So you sort of feel like, well, my little pathetic worries don't matter all that much in the grand scheme of things. Ralph Waldo Emerson, American 19th century essayist, felt this very intensely and said that he could feel the oneness of all things, number one, when he stared into a mud puddle on Boston Common. But the other thing he said, when he was walking through fields of wheat, he said he'd feel an intense sense of camaraderie and brotherhood with the wheat and the corn. And he said, the stalks of corn call out to me and greet me as a brother, and I greet them as a brother. I always thought if Emerson were still alive, it would be fun to go to a salad bar with him. I mentioned the broccoli. He said, hi, Waldo. And Waldo saying hello to the broccoli. So there have been disagreements about exactly what is the intuitive feeling. So like the innate spirituality that drives people to church. But a lot of Christians and others have said there is such a thing. We go to church because we have a visceral impulse to worship. And the last one, why do people go to church, is simple, and it's sociality. We like to hang around with people, and we like to hang around with like-minded people. We like to hang around with people who share our concerns and share our values and seem to care about us. So to put it simply, we go to church for the community. And it helps if the community is based on some commonly shared convictions and values. And that's why we get up on Sunday morning or Saturday morning or Friday night to go to a religious institution. So those have been the most popular understandings of why in the past have people been religious. And what I'd like to do in our towards the end of today is try to figure out, has something happened culturally to damage these motivations? There's something going on in society, in our culture, that where a lot of these motivations don't work anymore. And we'll talk about that. But right now, I'd like to just throw back to you, why are you religious? Why are you here? And I'll repeat what you say for the folk on Zoom. Yeah.
Can I just offer a thought, maybe one more idea that's a little distinct from a few of these, like the idea, especially coming from liberation theologies, like in marginalized communities, where it's not necessarily this hope in the after death,
Yeah.
but the hope even in the here and now, that God is with us. That means that there's like socio-political implications to our faith as well. I feel like it's a little distinct from that kind of religious nationalism one, because it's coming from those who are actually critiquing empire, critiquing
Right.
those power structures.
Right.
But it's not just when I die I have hope.
Right.
That we see especially, I would say, yeah, around the world, like the liberation theologies, around the global church, and a lot of, into some different traditions. Not so much in the white evangelical church, but
Yeah.
elsewhere.
Yeah, the observation is there might be another motivation which comes from marginalized communities where people need hope in the face of fairly daunting economic and political and cultural dynamics. They need hope that things can get better. And they find that through a belief in a God who is, let's say, providentially acting in history with them to bring about a better world. Just as an aside, I'm going to riff on that a little bit. I had occasion to, my seminary is writing a new mission statement. So to get some guidance, we were looking at the mission statements of other seminaries, both conservative ones, progressive ones, Catholic ones, Protestant ones, whole gamut. And what was surprising, at least to me, is that almost all of them had as number one that the purpose of training ministers for the church was to transform the world, was to make the world a better place. And a friend from Britain who was visiting and looked at that and said, it's kind of a big task. I'm glad that wasn't exactly written into my missions, my job description. Although I had like 3 years to change the world. But that's a big one. It is associated with a movement called liberation theology, and before that, the social gospel, where religion does exist and people are religious in order to give them hope that progress in history towards love, peace, and justice is possible, and that God is working with us to do that. I tend to put that as a subcategory of the sacred canopy, that our way of life is divinely sanctioned, only this is a way of life from the bottom, not the top. That it's still God's on our side. But now it's not legitimating a nation or a way of life or the American flag. It's legitimating a political movement of empowerment and emancipation. Yeah.
To answer the question about why I go to church or am religious, I believe it was that there were two right after another. One was like you have an instinctive, innate desire to connect with God.
Yeah.
Because I can say for myself, I have been to churches that I didn't think were good churches, but I enjoyed being in a space where I could connect with God. So while I may not have found relation with the people, I still felt like my spiritual tank was being filled because I could commune with God, being in that space. And then the second one, which is probably like the most driving reason is community, the sense of community that you get when you go to church. But that one would be when you're with like-minded people and they do have those same worldviews and the same morals as you, your spiritual tank is filled and you also feel that sense of fellowship. And so I think for me, that would be why.
Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, you were saying that maybe people go to church, or you go to church, because we have an instinctive drive to connect with God. And that would fall in that intuitive, visceral camp. And also for community,
Yeah.
with like-minded and like-hearted
Mm-hmm.
people who think and feel, have the same commitments and values, worldview that we do. Yeah.
I think, when I think about myself, I think it's a combination of a couple of things. Generations of family tradition, something everybody did. And also I think, even on a given Sunday, if I don't go to church, I feel guilty. So out of a sense of obligation to not feel that guilt, you go to church. And I think my mother was a Southern Baptist, and my father, generations of Presbyterian. And I think listening to them talk, my mother would often talk about there was nothing more important than going to church on Sunday morning and being part of a community, but also God expected that. And if you don't do that, God doesn't like you anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, so there the remark was, maybe some people have gone to church and do go to church out of a sort of family tradition. It's just the moment. It's just what you do, coupled with maybe a little dose of fear that if I don't do it, God will be angry and I will suffer the consequences, either now or in eternity or both. Yeah, I grew up with Baptists and Methodists, and going to college was quite a shock when I realized, number one, nobody else is getting up to go to church, and they're not getting struck down by God. Maybe I don't have to get up. Yeah, in fact, thanks for mentioning that, because those are two big ones that I neglected to mention. Maybe many folk go to, or at least used to go to church because it's just what everybody does. It's the family tradition, it's the communal expectation. I know in Lancaster there was a corporation that shall remain nameless. Yeah, this is being broadcast, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There was a corporation somewhere that in the 1950s, when they were hiring in their upper management, would ask people their religious affiliation and recommend specific congregations that they should join if they wanted to be promoted or hired or promoted in the company. If somebody said, well, I really am not a member of anything and I have no intention of becoming so, you are regarded as untrustworthy and weird, and therefore unsuited for a responsible position in the corporation. Those days are over. So there is less social pressure. In fact, there might be very little social pressure to go to church. And that's including family traditions. Often, I know a lot of people who teach theology and church history and biblical studies who've devoted their lives to that and love it. Almost none of their children attend church. And we're talking adult children. So, and their grandchildren certainly don't. Haven't been confirmed, haven't been baptized. So those family traditions are being disrupted. And the social pressure, or just the feeling that going to church is the right thing to do, is evaporating. And also the fear of damnation or divine displeasure if you don't, has also disappeared. personally, I think, thankfully, that's disappeared, because I think that's an unworthy reason to go to church, like, just guilt or fear. As churches, at least the Protestant main line, and Catholicism even, and most evangelicals even, have backed off the notion of you're going to get zapped or you're going to go to hell if you don't mind your P's and Q's. When was the last time at Derry Presbyterian that you heard a sermon about the terrors of hell? Or even divine displeasure? If you did something wrong, you would suffer consequences either on earth or in the afterlife.
May have heard that from the music director, but not the.
Yeah.
I guess in my own case, it's clearly a mix of the things you've mentioned, and that probably my portioning out, which is which, would vary from day to day. But institutionally, a religious institution like this, I think there's something for me that provides a structure that I wouldn't trust myself to sort of completely understand if I was an autodidact about it. If that's the right use of that term.
Yeah. So, and so you're talking about a spiritual structure?
Everything really.
Yeah.
Life structure,
Yeah. So folk need, and for some religions, that's probably more important than a more central thing than others. For Judaism, I think that's the name of the game. A focus on this is the way we do things. This is the way we navigate life. These are the rules. These are the structures. If you're a conservative or Orthodox Jew, there's dietary codes. There's codes about everything. And many religions do have ways of structuring all of life. Here's what you should do under certain circumstances. Here's what you celebrate. Here's what you avoid. Here's what you should aim at. These should be your goals. These other things should be avoided. And they can pertain to behavior, values, all kinds of things. So thanks for that. I've heard in interviews I've done with people, a lot of them say they want a sense of mooring. Their life is tied to something and a certain structure, so that they're not just wandering or adrift.
Yeah, similar to that is also to challenge your own self-centric worldview, so that you can get some more objective teachings of the Bible as opposed to just reaffirming what you already think is good for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just to learn other people's points of view too. So as a church, it would be helpful that we can all challenge each other in that regard.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think that's a coming together of the sociality theme, and also I'm not the center of the universe intuition, where you put them together and you get, I'm not the center of the universe, and I also don't know everything. And I'm not sure that my opinions about religious, moral, and any other kind of matter, I'm not sure they're right. So I need to check them out against something more objective, including the perspectives and opinions of the people I worship with. I need a community to serve as a check and balance against my own idiosyncrasies, because left to my own devices, I'm probably biased in my own direction. So I need some external critique, and it could come from other people, the Bible, the doctrinal tradition. Thanks for that one.
I think for me, when I started going to church was in my college years, and I think I fit that description of the idea of a journey and wanting to answer questions and sort of figure things out, and didn't even necessarily want the answer, but just enjoyed that process. And for me, that led me into religion. I know you were saying that for some it doesn't, right? But for me, I think it did. And so I think I coincidentally, just because of the people I was with and everything, ended up in a specific religious institution. And then in recent years, I think what Edgar was saying of this idea of wanting to be around different people that challenge you and things like that, I think that moved me into the mainstream church, because I felt like in some of the more orthodox evangelical churches, a lot of times, like, I would try to question things and talk to people about it, and it usually was like the answer is, well, the Westminster Confession of Faith is this, instead of having like an actual dialogue about it and things like that. And so, like, I think, like, I still enjoy that journey. I still enjoy trying to figure things out and trying to have conversations with people and saying, maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe you're wrong about this, maybe it's somewhere in the middle, you know, who knows? And you know, it's a process that, like, I don't really want to end. I want to keep trying to figure things out and keep trying to improve myself and grow and learn new things and stuff like that.
Right. That's an interesting way of putting it. You do want the journey, and you still like that, but and you don't want pat answers, and you do want to be challenged by other folks. I had a student who loved the theme of life is a journey, and we're on a spiritual quest. And she toyed with the idea of dropping out of seminary because she was afraid that she was getting an answer. I mean, and it wasn't that we were spoon feeding her an answer. It's that she thought, I think I'm getting it figured out, and I don't want that. So, because I like the questions. So that was an extreme example of someone liking the question. We have 1 minute?
Yeah, that was it. 1 minute, yeah.
Okay. Any other 30-second observations? Well, next week what we're going to do is I'm going to look at these reasons for why people have been religious and have joined religious institutions, and try to reflect upon, given the characteristics of the nuns and our society, why may some of these motivations be weakened? Because it seems that they are. And just as a quick preview of what's to come, like, for example, sociality. You know, you go for community. Church isn't the only show in town anymore for community. There are competitors.